Recently, I flew into Dallas to check out Universal Kids Resort, which I'm sure you saw the video on what a disaster that has been. But with 3 days in the area, I also wanted to check out Six Flags Over Texas. I wasn't sure if I would produce a video on this park, because initially, I wanted to cover its history as the first ever Six Flags. But the issue was that I got rained out for half the day, and I wasn't able to gather the footage I needed. I thought about coming back here for my final day, but the weather was still pretty nasty, and honestly, there were other experiences I was glad to have done instead, like Grapevine Meow Wolf, the Dallas Zoo, and the Fort Worth Zoo. So, while I plan to come back here eventually to maybe do a more in-depth video about the park's history, for now, I think I'll just do a general review of the park because this was far better than I expected. Coming in, I'd heard nothing but bad things about it from an operational perspective, with slow, barely moving lines, and a general lack of care from employees. But not only did I see the opposite, as the park was very clean and employees were pretty attentive to its cleanliness, but the ride operations were very focused on safety, and while not the fastest, were still sending out trains at a decent pace. Maybe I just got lucky with how I made my way through the park, and because the rain cleared out a lot of people in the second half of the day, but I was genuinely impressed, as I expected very little from it. I went into here somewhat blind, and not really knowing the ride lineup, but I was actually very impressed by the collection of coasters here, along with Pirates of Spelunker Cave, a dark ride that I found to be incredibly charming. So let me walk you through my day at Six Flags Over Texas, because while I expected very little, I was actually quite impressed, and it's far better than people are giving it credit for. Having not really kept up with park news recently, I knew that as I entered Six Flags, it had just opened a brand new coaster, Tormenta Rampaging Run, but I knew very little about it. From the entrance, it's truly impressive, standing as the world's first Giga dive coaster, topping out at 309 feet. Watching it cycle as the trains roar through both the world's largest Immelmann and vertical loop, it projects a sense of immense power that's impressive to watch, conveying the idea of running from its namesake, Tormenta, a legendary raging bull. Located in the Spain area of the park, I was impressed by the theming for Six Flags, which included a statue of the bull and an entrance arch that's aesthetically interesting. Throughout the queue, while it is mostly just basic switchbacks, you will see themed posters, which is nice, and while the station is still somewhat basic, I made the point in my Universal Kids video that it still has more decoration and thematic elements than I ever saw at Universal's newest park. Approaching the line, I didn't realize that this had only been open for 6 days, but I apparently got here at just the right time, because I only waited about 20 minutes for it, and the ride experience is fine. It's big, it looks impressive, and dive coasters are crowd pleasers for your general Six Flags park goer, but because I've been on so many coasters and I've become desensitized to them, I just don't think that Tormenta did much for me. While the world's tallest dive coaster, it's still just a dive coaster at the end of the day, and its inversions feel relatively mild and smooth when you're going through them, while still getting some decent positive Gs. That said, the coaster did have a noticeable rattle, which people have been calling out B&M on over the past few years, but this is the first of their larger newer coasters that I've experienced, and while the rattle is definitely there, I doubt the average person will notice it because it doesn't really affect the ride experience. I only noticed it because I knew to look for it, but if you didn't know any better, you would just think that's how a large coaster rides. Overall, while it looks impressive, it didn't really do much for me, but I still think it's a great fit for this park, considering that most people riding it will be a local audience who will still find its sheer height and size intimidating. Moving on, the next ride I encountered was El Asadero, or in English, the Sawmill, which is notably historic as the world's first ever log flume, having premiered at this park in 1963. Its layout is relatively simple as you pleasantly move through the woods, and you don't even really get more than a sprinkle of water on you as you go down the drop. But as a piece of unassuming ride history, I still found it interesting, even if its ride layout is a bit primitive by today's standards. I knew that I also wanted to get a ride on New Texas Giant, the first ever RMC conversion of a traditional wooden coaster, which opened in 2011. But while it did have a line this early in the day, I never saw it send a train while we were in this area of the park, and so we moved on to Titan. Going into Six Flags Over Texas mostly blind, I didn't really know what this was, but walking right on, I was surprised by what I found. I could tell that it was something built during the hypercoaster craze of the Coaster Wars era, and looking it up, yeah, it opened in 2001. I also recognized that the track looked very similar to the B&M box beam style, although the track layout was nothing like they would build, so I was pleased to learn that Giovanola built this coaster, which I recognized the name of, but wasn't really that familiar with their work. This is definitely a rare coaster model, which is a large part of its appeal to me, but how was the actual layout? To my surprise, this was very intense, because despite being outclassed in height by Tormenta and lacking inversions, the strong positive Gs, especially through that first upward helix, were unexpectedly sustained and intense. I wasn't expecting much from this, because I've been on Giovanola's other remaining American hypercoaster, Goliath at Six Flags Magic Mountain, which is just underwhelming in every aspect, but Titan was the complete opposite. There were a lot of moments where I was grayed out, and I started to lose my vision because of how strong the G-forces were, which is exactly the kind of intensity I'm looking for. What also struck me about Titan is just how much it feels like it's stuck in time from the Coaster Wars, because despite having actually gotten an updated color scheme with a new paint job in 2025, it still retains a certain aesthetic and charm from 25 years ago that makes it feel like a classic, even though I hadn't heard of it before visiting the park. I walked right onto this and expected very little, but Titan was great, and already within the first hour of being in the park, I experienced 3 rides that were excellent. Returning and walking back past New Texas Giant, it still had not sent a train despite being posted at a 75-minute wait, and for whatever reason, we decided to try the nearby Dino Off-Road Adventure, which was absolutely bizarre. The track for this was installed in 1962 for an antique car ride, but was most recently updated in 2023 to add dinosaur animatronics along the track. I actually thought that this was a great addition just because of how ridiculous it was, and I did see some speculation that these figures actually came from the Dinosaurs Alive exhibits spread across the Cedar Fair parks from before they merged with Six Flags. If you can confirm that this is true, let me know in the comments, but I think that's more than plausible, considering that when I visited Six Flags America before it closed permanently last year, one thing that stood out to me was how they included dinosaurs in their raft ride, which is equally bizarre. Still, at Six Flags Over Texas, which does have some light theming, but is still basically an amusement park at this point, I like that Dino Off-Road Adventure just went for something that was pure fun, and turned what would have been an uninteresting car ride into something notable. The attraction also has a great view of the oil derrick, an impressive observation tower that has stood in the park since 1969. I'm disappointed that this was closed, because its striking structure has impressed me since I first discovered it in Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 when I was a little kid, so I'm hoping that once I eventually return to the park, it might possibly be open. The next attraction I encountered was Pirates of Spelunker Cave, which I think a lot of people have been asking me to cover for a long time, and it's about as weird as I've been told. I thought this ride was great, and despite being relatively low budget, that's a big part of what makes it charming, because I love when dark rides need to get creative and end up becoming unique. That being said, I don't want to cover this ride in this video because I want to visit Six Flags Over Georgia before the end of this year, and I think it would be great to pair this ride with Monster Mansion, so I do want to save its discussion for later. By this point, the park started to close down because the storm was rolling in, and so there was very little that was open. To wait out the rain, which lasted a good 4 hours, I waited for Justice League Battle for Metropolis, which I wouldn't have done unless it was raining, but we all know it's pretty bad. And then once the rain let up a bit, but the other rides were still closed, I waited through the queue for Runaway Mountain. I could tell from the exterior that this was left over from an era where Six Flags still put a small degree of effort into theming, although never anything on the scale of Disney, and while on the line, I looked and saw that it opened in 1996 as the first ever coaster from Premier Rides. Once inside the interior of the queue, it was relatively short, although the line crawled, and entering the station, it's clear that this coaster has pretty awful capacity and loaded very slowly. Not knowing what to expect, it dispatched into the darkness and made for one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. What you're seeing now is the lights on POV posted by Six Flags, but the experience is comical because in the darkness, it's clear that this building isn't properly sealed, and there's strips of light from the outside shining into what is essentially just a large box. The coaster layout was fine, although weirdly, the lap restraints pull into your chest, and so when you pull into the brakes, your sternum smashes into the lap bar. I guess it's more funny than painful, but considering the lack of theming in what is clearly a roller coaster in a box, it's definitely a one and done, even for when I eventually revisit the park. Once the park began to open back up, I had to decide between getting everything I wanted done or using the last few hours to collect footage for a video. And the way it turned out in my indecision, the majority of my footage is from the Gotham City area. I want to make the point that while this was a decently themed area in 1998, when Six Flags was at least trying, this part of the park is just so ugly today. I didn't capture a lot of footage of other areas, but what strikes me about Six Flags Over Texas is that the west side of the park is actually very aesthetically pleasing and almost beautiful, but the east side is just downright ugly concrete and asphalt. For whatever reason, Gotham City and an American-themed area called Good Times Square basically blend into one another. And while again, Gotham looks great for the 90s, it's just painfully outdated today, and I think it's about time for the new Six Flags company to reconsider its relationship with DC Comics. Because I was unsure of how I wanted to economize my time between filming and actually getting rides done, I decided not to wait for Batman the Ride, because while it's a great inverted B&M, this would have been my third clone of the same exact ride, and it didn't feel worth the 30-minute wait. The same applied with The Joker, an S&S free spin that I've been on at Six Flags Great America, and I really just don't ever feel the need to do it again. However, Mr. Freeze didn't reopen after the rain, which a lot of people have told me to try, and so as I was about to walk away from the area after having given up on waiting, it quietly reopened and I was first in line. To my surprise, there was a lot more theming in the queue than I expected, which pleasantly subverted my expectations. I have heard that this coaster has been experiencing a lot of technical issues and operations are slow, so it was nice to walk right on, and the first thing that struck me as interesting was the switch track, which brings you from the station and into the launch. Back when I visited Six Flags America, I was a bit nervous about Joker's Jinx, which is a premiere coaster from 1999, and from the way it screamed through its launch, I was afraid it would be painfully rough. To my surprise, it wasn't. It was a much better experience than I anticipated, and now with Mr. Freeze, I think it has solidified my opinion that early premiere coasters are actually pretty great, and run very well even today. Their trains and restraint systems are always very weird from this early era, but they're certainly a lot more comfortable than the trains they're producing for their newer rides, especially the Skyrockets. Mr. Freeze's layout is rather short and disorienting, but it packs a fun little punch for what it is, while never being rough or uncomfortable. The addition of the solid theming in the queue really sold me on this overall experience, although I don't know if I would feel the same way if I hadn't walked right on. Anyways, from here though, I marathoned a series of coasters in the last 2 hours that the park was open, moving next to Judge Roy Scream. Manufactured by William Cobb & Associates in 1980, a company I've never heard of, this was the most neutral I've ever felt about a wooden coaster. For me, wooden coasters are usually a love or hate kind of experience, where they're either excellent, well-paced, and relatively smooth, while still providing that signature ricketiness, or are otherwise incredibly rough as you white-knuckle the restraint and try not to accidentally bite your tongue off. Judge Roy Scream, while not smooth by any means, did find a middle ground of being just kind of alright, which had some rough sections, but otherwise wasn't intense enough to really provide too much of a thrill. I also walked right onto this, so I can't complain, but the ops on the station were just talking with each other and ignoring people in the gates until someone yelled at them, after which they threw dirty looks at everyone trying to ride and reluctantly started to load the vehicle. I did say earlier in the video that the operations at this park were surprisingly safety focused and moved somewhat consistently, but this was the exception, and the ops here never actually checked the restraints other than rolling their eyes and lightly tapping the lap bar. To finish out this area of the park, it includes 2 coasters, notable for both being early aerodynamics coasters with a lot of that signature roughness from being designed by hand, but still having a sense of charm to them as pieces of history. Located right next to each other, there is the Runaway Mine Train, which opened in 1966, and the Mini Mine Train, which opened in 1969, intended to be a less intense kids version. Along with Runaway Mountain, the naming gets a little confusing here, but I started with the Mini Mine Train, which was fine but a little bit rough, which is what I expected from it. I was satisfied with my one ride through, but there were little girls in the train screaming for another ride as there was no one at the station, so despite asking to get off, the ride ops just sent the train again anyways, so I guess I rode it twice. I know I just got done saying that the operations were pretty good at this park for the most part, but in retrospect, I'm actually pretty annoyed with this. Still, it's a great little classic aero meant for kids, and I then moved on to Runaway Mine Train, which was even better. It's significantly longer, running at about 3.5 minutes, and it's just so delightfully classic in every sense of the word. The old hand-bent track sitting on top of the wooden supports is a bit rough, but charmingly vintage, and you can tell that before a bunch of other nearby coasters were shoved in, this was a secluded ride through the woods, where you would move through some basic Western theming elements. A standout here is the third lift hill, which guides you into a saloon where dummies are sitting around drinking, and overall, the novelty of its antiquated design made this a big standout in the park for me. I'm glad that I was able to ride it because I almost skipped it in the last hour the park was open, because finally, now it was time to move all the way back over to the other side of the park to try to ride New Texas Giant. Before anyone asks, no, I didn't get the chance to ride Shockwave, as it was literally missing pieces of a track, so I don't think that's coming back anytime soon, if at all. And the entire north side of the park was closed off too, although from looking at a map, it didn't seem like there was really much there. So finally, with about 20 minutes of park time left, I finally made it to New Texas Giant, and while the line moved slowly, as I discovered it was running a single train, I still only waited roughly 20 minutes for it at the very end of the day. While I like coasters, I'm definitely not a coaster enthusiast, because I feel like that community absolutely hates my opinions on what I find interesting in coaster design, but I'm just going to say it. I thought New Texas Giant was way more interesting than Iron Gwazi. The issue with Iron Gwazi is that it's a little too streamlined, and there aren't any standout moments other than the massive drop. And yes, I know everyone is just going to say I'm rage baiting or whatever, but I truly do find it underwhelming and very one-note. What stood out to me about New Texas Giant is that as the first RMC conversion to open in 2011, it's clear that they hadn't really found their own best practices for coaster design yet, and while it's still very smooth and the transitions are great, there's something about its layout that just feels a little less refined that makes it feel more unique. I also like how it's relatively low to the ground, often bucking you out of the seat, but never in a way that felt painful or excessive like the series of bunny hops at the end of Air Force One. I think what also helps is that as the first RMC coaster, the trains were instead designed by Gerstlauer and were notably a lot more comfortable than the trains that RMC has provided for its later coasters. It's smooth, whippy, gives you some nice pops of ejector air time, and is just overall an important piece of coaster history, while also helping to make the coaster lineup of this park stand out. I think that might be my biggest takeaway from Six Flags Over Texas, that it feels like its coaster collection is a lot better balanced than I anticipated it would be. From the novelty of a Giga dive coaster with Tormenta, to standouts like Titan and New Texas Giant, those all in themselves should be a big draw here. I also found a lot of value with Runaway Mine Train and its mini version because of their historical nature, and the park has some very solid supplementary coasters like Batman and Mr. Freeze. Add in some additional experiences like Dino Off-Road Adventure, the Log Flume, and Pirates of Spelunker Cave, and I found this park to have a very desirable ride lineup. I am disappointed that the Oil Derrick and Shockwave were closed, because I think they might have added a lot of value to the park experience too. Other than some small operational issues with Judge Roy's Scream, I also want to say that the staff of this park were operating a lot better than I expected from Six Flags, and the entire west side of the park was a lot more aesthetically pleasing than I initially ever would have anticipated. I think that the company knows that there's a lot of potential here that's being underutilized, And while the park understandably doesn't adhere to the theming of the original Six Nations that flew their flags over Texas, I thought there were some interesting theming elements around the park that I would have gone into if I had more time to produce the video that I intended. Going into this, I expected a park with a somewhat underwhelming ride lineup and long, painfully slow lines. And while a lot of my timing and the rain rolling through might have made a big difference in that, I still had a much better time here than I anticipated. I would like to eventually return to Dallas to revisit this park and do some of the other experiences I missed in the city as part of a larger Texas road trip. And part of the reason for this is that Six Flags Over Texas really exceeded my expectations, and there was so much more that I wanted to experience. Again, this isn't the video I intended to produce, but I'm sure there are people who wanted to know my opinion of the park, especially since a lot of the theming and scenic design blew away pretty much everything that I saw at Universal Kids Resort. So, if you would like to support the channel, I would very much appreciate it if you left a like on the video. As always, if you haven't yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.